Welcome to the Unseen Whispers, where the stories linger long after the night fades. Before we dive into tonight's chilling tale, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because some stories feel different in the dead of night. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Story 1. The black-eyed farmers. Sarah Larson had spent years dreaming of a life outside the noise and chaos of city living. The daily rush, the constant traffic, the endless hum of urban life. She was done. When she and her husband Mark had finally decided to leave it all behind, it wasn't just a whim, it was a necessity. They needed something different, something quieter. After months of searching, they found the perfect place. A modest farmhouse on a sprawling piece of land in Hollow Creek, Iowa. A place where the fields stretched endlessly beneath the open sky. "I thought you'd be more excited, Sarah," Mark said as they pulled into their new driveway, the old car grumbling beneath them as they made the final turn toward their new home. "I'm just adjusting," Sarah replied, her voice quieter than usual. The house sat at the edge of a small town, its weathered boards and slanted roof giving it the rustic charm Sarah had envisioned. She could almost smell the fresh air already, the earth, the grass. They were about to begin a new chapter. The kids, Emily, who was 12, and Ben, 8, had already begun to explore the land, their laughter echoing in the distance. But Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling deep in her gut. There was something wrong with the place. It wasn't the house itself or the land. It was the town, the people, the strange way they all seemed to stare, eyes too wide, as if something was always hidden behind them. And there was one thing that unsettled Sarah more than anything else: the eyes. It started with an encounter at the local grocery store. Mrs. Mayfield, the grocer, greeted Sarah with a wide smile, but her eyes were wrong. They were black, devoid of any light, staring directly at Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. For a moment, Sarah thought it was just her imagination. But no, it wasn't just Mrs. Mayfield. A few days later at the general store, she saw the same thing again. Mr. Jackson, the farmer who lived down the road, had the same black eyes. The darkness in them wasn't natural. "What the hell is going on here?" Sarah muttered to herself. When she returned home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. Something invisible but all too real. That night, as the family sat down for their first dinner in the new home, the wind howled outside, pressing against the windows, a deep creaking coming from the old walls. It was the kind of wind that made the house feel alive, as if the very structure was holding its breath. Mark was oblivious, casually passing the mashed potatoes to Emily. Ben, on the other hand, had a faraway look in his eyes, staring out the window into the darkness. "Mom," Emily asked quietly, "why do the people here look so strange?" Before Sarah could respond, a loud knock at the door broke her train of thought. She stood up quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. When she opened the door, no one was there, just the cold wind and the echo of the town stretching out beyond the porch. A chill ran down her spine. It was the first of many odd occurrences. The town of Hollow Creek was quiet, far quieter than Sarah had anticipated. She had expected peace, but this was something else. The streets were empty most days, and when she did see someone, they always kept to themselves, their eyes darting away quickly when they met hers. It wasn't that the people were unfriendly, rather, they were distant, strangely so. One evening, after a few days of getting used to the isolation, Sarah decided to take a walk into town. She told herself it was to clear her head, but deep down, she knew it was to see if there was anyone else around, anyone she could connect with. As she walked through the quiet streets, she couldn't help but notice the odd silence that seemed to grip the place. No dogs barking, no children laughing, no cars driving by. It was as if Hollow Creek had been abandoned, save for its eerie residents. She crossed paths with a few people, but none of them stopped to speak to her. They just gave a quick nod, their hollow eyes fixed on the ground, and kept walking. It was when she passed by the old church that she saw him, a man standing in the shadow of the church, his back to her. His posture was stiff, unnatural. Sarah felt a sudden, unshakable urge to approach him. She found herself walking toward him without even realizing it. As she got closer, she noticed his hands. They were clenched tightly at his sides, the skin almost gray, stretched taut over bones. His face was weathered, lines etched deep into his forehead. But then, when he turned to face her, she froze. His eyes were black, completely, utterly black. No whites, no pupils, just endless hollow voids staring at her. He said nothing, but the terror she felt in that moment was suffocating. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. "Hello, ma'am," the man said, his voice too soft, too flat. What? What's wrong with you?" Sarah whispered, unable to stop herself. The man's lips curled into a thin smile, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a cold, knowing smile. "The harvesting shadow is coming," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "It always comes." Before Sarah could respond, the man turned and walked into the church, disappearing into the shadows. Her legs felt weak beneath her. She stumbled back, heart racing, and ran all the way back to the house. The days passed, but the unease continued to grow. Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong with the people of Hollow Creek. It wasn't just their eyes. There was something about the way they moved, the way they spoke, as if they weren't quite human anymore. That afternoon, she went to the library to search for answers. She pored through old newspapers and records, but found little. It wasn't until she found a dusty, old journal hidden in the back of the library that things started to make sense. The journal belonged to a man named Samuel Hollis, one of the town's original founders. His entries were bizarre, rambling about strange occurrences in the town. But there was one thing that stood out, a mention of an ancient evil, something called the harvesting shadow. The journal described how, every few generations, the people of Hollow Creek would be overtaken by this dark force. It would possess the farmers during harvest time, turning them into something not quite human. The shadow fed on fear, growing stronger with each passing year, until it was ready to claim new victims. And the only way to stop it was to destroy the heart of the shadow, hidden beneath the town. Sarah's hands shook as she read the last entry. Destroy the heart. But what did that mean? As the days passed, Sarah became more and more desperate. Her family had started to change. Mark, once so full of life, had become distant and cold. He had stopped talking to her, his eyes growing darker each day. Emily and Ben were showing signs of the same affliction. Emily's nightmares had gotten worse, and Ben was acting strange, talking to imaginary friends, staring blankly at the walls for hours. It was then that Sarah realized the harvesting shadow wasn't just possessing the townspeople. It was creeping into her home, taking over her family, and she had no time to waste. That night she gathered her courage and confronted Mark. "You're not yourself," she pleaded. "You have to fight it. We need to leave." Mark's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "We can't leave, Sarah. It's too late. The shadow has already chosen us." The weeks that followed Mark's cold declaration felt like they were slipping into a nightmare that Sarah couldn't wake up from. The house, once a symbol of peace and escape, had become a prison. Every night, Sarah lay awake, hearing the wind howl through the cracks in the walls. But it wasn't just the wind. The house had a presence now, an oppressive weight that settled like dust in the air. And then there were the dreams. They started quietly, with fleeting images of dark fields and shadowy figures, but they quickly turned into something far worse. In the silence of her sleep, Sarah would see the black-eyed townspeople standing at the edges of her bed, their hollow eyes staring down at her, watching her. Their faces were twisted into grotesque masks of hunger, but there was something more disturbing about them. Their expressions were vacant, as if they weren't aware they were doing it, as if they had no control over their actions. One night, in a dream so vivid it felt real, she woke up to see Mark sitting at the foot of their bed, his back turned to her. She reached out to touch him, but as her hand neared his shoulder, his head snapped around, his face completely changed. His eyes were black, and his smile was too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice low and hollow. "You're too late," she gasped. Fear gnawed at Sarah's every moment now. She had no idea how much time had passed since the strange incident started, but it didn't matter. The town was slipping into madness, and so was her family. It was as though the entire place had been consumed by the harvesting shadow. That afternoon, Sarah ventured into the woods that bordered their land, hoping for some semblance of peace, something to ease her racing mind. The woods were thick with mist, the trees towering over her like silent sentinels. As she walked deeper into the forest, she came across something unexpected. A small crumbling chapel hidden deep among the trees. The chapel was ancient, its stone walls covered in vines and moss, and as Sarah approached, she could feel the air around her shift. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. She stepped inside, heart pounding, the floor creaking beneath her feet. Inside the chapel, the air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the walls were adorned with strange symbols. Runes, her mind recognized them from the old journal. But what really caught her attention was the altar, raised and darkened with what seemed to be centuries-old bloodstains. The stone slab shimmered faintly, and etched into the altar's surface was a single word: harvest. Her heart stopped as she traced the word with her fingers. The word seemed to pulse beneath her touch, as if the stone itself were alive. She jerked her hand back in shock, stumbling away from the altar. That was when she heard it, a voice, a whisper, seeping from the walls, echoing in her mind. Sarah. Sarah Larson. Her body froze. The voice was soft, almost comforting, but something inside her screamed that it wasn't. She turned around, and standing in the doorway was Mrs. Mayfield, the town's grocer, her black eyes fixed on Sarah with that same unsettling smile. The woman's lips parted, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "The harvesting shadow is coming for you, Sarah. It's already inside you. You can't run." Before Sarah could react, the ground beneath her feet shook violently. She stumbled, crashing to the ground as the walls of the chapel seemed to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly energy. The shadow in the corner of her eye flickered, something darker than the night itself, something that was alive. The next few days were a blur. Sarah couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Her mind was consumed by one thought: the shadow is inside me. It's already too late. But there was something else, something buried beneath the fear, a glimmer of hope. The journal had spoken of the heart of the shadow, a place where its power was concentrated. If she could destroy it, the cycle would end, and she was running out of time. Her family was no longer just altered. They were lost to the shadow. Mark's once gentle eyes had turned entirely black, his presence oppressive. Emily, normally a sweet girl, had grown eerily quiet, her gaze vacant, as though she wasn't truly present anymore. Ben, too, had fallen silent, his face pallid, his movements stiff and unnatural. The evil was spreading, and it was clawing at the edges of her own mind. Sarah knew what she had to do. That evening, under the cover of darkness, she ventured back into the town's hidden depths. She remembered something from the journal. Beneath the town, there was an old crypt, where the heart of the harvesting shadow had been sealed away. She had to find it. The road to the crypt was narrow and treacherous, overgrown with roots and twisted vines. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over everything. As she approached the crypt's entrance, she could hear it, the faint sound of chanting. The door to the crypt creaked open, as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of decay and age, and the walls seemed to whisper. Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she saw them. Dozens of townsfolk, their faces gaunt and lifeless, standing in a circle around a pulsing black mass that hovered in the center of the room. The heart, it was not of flesh but of dark energy, a swirling, suffocating vortex that seemed to breathe with an otherworldly force. And within it, Sarah could see shadows shifting, moving, twisting. The townspeople's hollow eyes were fixed on the heart, and in that moment, Sarah knew they weren't in control anymore. The shadow had consumed them entirely. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. There was no turning back now. Sarah reached the altar in the center of the crypt, where the heart pulsed violently, sending ripples of dark energy through the air. She could feel the shadow's power wrapping around her, pulling at her very soul. "I know you can hear me," Sarah whispered into the darkness. "I will end you." She pulled the dagger from her belt, its blade gleaming faintly in the dark. The journal had described the ritual. She had to destroy the heart in the heart of the shadow's power. The ground trembled as she raised the dagger high. The moment the blade made contact with the dark mass, everything went silent. The power of the shadow surged outward in a violent explosion, knocking Sarah off her feet. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the smiling face of Mark, his eyes still black and empty, his mouth stretched in that terrible grin. When Sarah awoke, the crypt was quiet. The heart had been destroyed, the power of the shadow dissipated, but only for now. The townspeople lay motionless around her, their bodies lifeless shells, their black eyes staring into nothingness. She had won, for now. But as Sarah stumbled out of the crypt, she knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. The harvesting shadow would return. It always did. The wind screamed through the jagged peaks of the Teton Mountains, carrying with it the scent of pine and the faintest hint of something older, something ancient. The small town of Hemlock Ridge, nestled at the base of the mountains, seemed to absorb the chill, as though the land itself had been frozen in time. Sheriff Ethan Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into a world not his own. The air was thick with something he couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the isolation of the place, maybe the overbearing quiet, but something about it felt wrong. Ethan had always been a man who thrived on routine. He'd served as a police officer in Denver for 5 years, and he knew what it meant to uphold the law, to stand against those who threatened peace. So when the job offer came to be the sheriff of Hemlock Ridge, he figured it would be a simple escape from the city, quiet, away from the noise and the mess of urban life. But as his truck rumbled through the town's weathered main street, Ethan felt a gnawing sense of discomfort that he couldn't ignore. The town was more isolated than he had expected. The buildings were old, much older than anything in the city. Many of them appeared to be abandoned. A few shops stood open, but the curtains inside were drawn, and no one ventured out. Even the dogs, who usually barked at any noise, were silent. Ethan parked his truck outside the sheriff's office, a creaky 2-story wooden building that had seen better days. He stepped out and stretched his legs, breathing in the cold mountain air. The silence was deafening, and it felt as though the very ground under his feet was holding its breath. New sheriff in town? A voice broke through his thoughts. Ethan turned to see an older man, hunched and weathered, with a gray beard and a wide-brimmed hat. He stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, staring at him with eyes that seemed to know too much. "That's right, Ethan Hayes," the sheriff said, offering a polite handshake. The man didn't take his hand. He merely nodded, his gaze shifting toward the mountains. "You'll find it quiet here. Quiet, but not peaceful." The strange words hung in the air. Before Ethan could respond, the man shuffled off, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As the days passed, Ethan settled into his new role. The town was exactly what he expected, a place where nothing happened. The sheriff's office was sparse, with only a couple of deputies and a few citizens ever needing assistance. However, there was one thing Ethan couldn't shake. The town had an air of dread. The townsfolk, while polite, acted strangely. They didn't seem to engage in the normal pleasantries that one might expect. People would wave, smile, and quickly retreat indoors. No one lingered on the streets, and no one talked about their lives. On his second day in the office, Ethan decided to pay a visit to the town's diner. The small square building had a flickering neon sign that said "The Pines Diner." Inside, the room was dimly lit, with wood-paneled walls and a long counter where a handful of people sat, eating in silence. Ethan grabbed a seat at the counter and ordered a coffee, his eyes scanning the room. The people here were distant, their expressions unreadable. When they spoke, their voices were low, almost as if they were afraid of saying something wrong. As he sipped his coffee, a few townsfolk glanced at him from the corner of their eyes, but quickly looked away. The waitress, a woman in her mid-40s named Judy, came to refill his cup. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the pot down, and when she caught his eye, she seemed to hesitate before speaking. "First time here, Sheriff?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, moved here to take over for, well, the last sheriff." Judy's face went pale. She hesitated before answering, wiping her hands on a rag. You'll learn about it soon enough. Everyone does." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Learn about what?" She bit her lip, avoiding his gaze. "Nothing, Sheriff. You'll see." The odd comment weighed on his mind as he paid for his coffee and left the diner. As he stepped out, the sun was already setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the town. The air had a sharp bite to it, and the once lively streets were now completely deserted. That night, Ethan walked the town, checking the patrol routes. He felt eyes on him, but when he turned to look, there was no one there. The feeling of being watched grew stronger each night, and the hairs on the back of his neck would stand on end, as though the town itself was conspiring against him. The next day, while examining the records in the sheriff's office, Ethan stumbled upon an old case file, one that had been marked confidential. The file contained nothing but the name of the former sheriff, George Daniels, who had mysteriously vanished the previous year. No one had seen or heard from him since his disappearance. According to the records, the disappearance was written off as a possible escape from responsibility. A lazy, uninvestigated conclusion. But there was something strange about the file. A map had been attached to it. A map that led deep into the forest, towards a forgotten area near the edge of town. Ethan's curiosity spiked. Why had the sheriff gone there? What had happened? As night fell, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of the woods, staring at the faint outline of the trail that would lead him to the location marked on the map. The wind was picking up again, carrying with it the scent of pine and something darker, something that smelled like rot. Before he could take a step into the trees, a voice stopped him. "Best not to go there, Sheriff." The voice called from the darkness. It was the same man from the sheriff's office. He stepped from the shadows, his eyes narrow and filled with caution. "There are things in those woods, things you don't want to find." Ethan turned to face him. "What do you mean? What's in the woods?" The man simply shook his head. "You'll find out soon enough, Sheriff. You always do. Just remember, you can't fight what's coming." With that cryptic warning, the man disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. The unease settled deeper into his bones. Ethan couldn't shake the old man's warning. It echoed in his mind as he drove back to his modest home on the edge of town that evening. The darkness seemed to close in around him as the night crept over Hemlock Ridge. The thought of the old map and the strange warnings weighed heavily on him, but he pushed it to the back of his mind. After all, he was the sheriff now. It was his job to protect the town, no matter how odd it seemed. As the days passed, he began to notice more peculiarities. The townspeople never seemed to change. No one aged. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there it was. The same elderly man who'd warned him about the woods had been there for years. He never looked older. Judy, the waitress at the diner, looked exactly the same as the first day he met her, as did most of the people who came and went. Ethan had spent hours in the town archives, hoping to find something that could explain the strange behavior of the townspeople. Most of the records were from the town's founding, but there was one particular file, buried deep beneath layers of dust, that stood out. It was a journal, a personal account of one of the original settlers, a man named Samuel Thorne, who had written about something dark beneath the land. The journal was cryptic, but Ethan could understand enough to grasp the terrifying idea behind it. The settlers had found something, an ancient temple buried deep beneath the earth, and as the town began to grow, so did the dark presence that slumbered below. It wasn't just a god, it was something far worse. Samuel Thorne had written that it was not just a god that demanded a sacrifice each year, but a force of nature, older than anything they could comprehend. The journal mentioned the ritual in detail, the need for a new sheriff every year, someone to serve as a vessel, to feed the god and ensure the prosperity of the town. The journal's final entry was chilling. It was as if Samuel Thorne had realized too late what the price would be for keeping the town safe. His last words, scrawled in desperation, were, "The sheriff will never leave, not alive." The weight of the journal's discovery crushed Ethan. It explained so much, why the townspeople were always so calm, so resigned, as if they had long accepted their fate. Why no one ever spoke of the sheriff's disappearances. Why the town seemed stuck in time, with no one changing, no one growing older. The curse was real, and it had been in place long before he ever stepped foot in Hemlock Ridge. As the night of the sacrifice drew closer, the atmosphere in the town shifted. The air seemed heavier. Ethan's every movement was watched by prying eyes. His neighbors, people he had shared pleasantries with just days ago, now avoided him. The tension was palpable, like a dam about to burst. It was as if the town was holding its collective breath, waiting for the moment to come. Ethan tried to leave. He packed his things one evening, planning to drive straight to the nearest police station and escape this nightmare. But something happened that made him stop. The road outside the town had been blocked. Every route out of Hemlock Ridge was inexplicably shut off, as though someone or something had manipulated the natural flow of traffic. His truck wouldn't start, no matter how many times he tried the engine. Even his cell phone had no signal, though it had worked perfectly fine just hours before. And then, the warning signs began to appear. It started with small things. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line, watching him silently from a distance. The town itself felt alive. The houses were silent, but Ethan could hear faint whispers on the wind, strange voices that seemed to beckon him to come closer. He spent sleepless nights in the sheriff's office, trying to figure out what had happened to the missing sheriffs, researching any possible connection to disappearances in the town's history. But the deeper he dug, the more horrifying the truth became. There were no records of the previous sheriffs after their disappearance, no funeral, no bodies. It was as if they had never existed, and yet their faces, etched in old photographs on the walls, stared at him like ghosts. Ethan knew then that he was being watched, not just by the people of Hemlock Ridge, but by something much darker. The god beneath the town was aware of him now. The townsfolk had accepted their fate, but Ethan hadn't. He was the last sheriff, the one who would be chosen to end the cycle, whether he liked it or not. It was the evening before the night of the sacrifice. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with anticipation. Ethan had tried to reach out to the authorities, to anyone who might come and help, but the town's isolation worked against him. There was no one coming to rescue him, and the closer the date came, the more the people of Hemlock Ridge seemed to anticipate his failure. They would not help him. They couldn't. The townsfolk gathered that evening for what appeared to be a festival. The streets were alive with movement, but it was a strange, eerie kind of festivity. There was music playing in the distance, but it was discordant, almost unearthly. The children wore masks, their eyes wide and unblinking, and the adults stood motionless in the street, watching Ethan from afar. Ethan approached Sylvia Green, the town's historian, desperate for answers. "You know what's coming," he said, his voice tight with panic. "I've seen the records. I know about the god beneath the town. I know about the ritual. Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Sylvia looked at him with sorrowful eyes, and for the first time her voice quivered with emotion. "I did warn you, Sheriff," she said softly, "but you didn't want to listen. The ritual is ancient, and it cannot be stopped. We cannot defy it. If we do, it will destroy us all." "What do you mean?" Ethan demanded, his hands trembling. "You're telling me I have no choice? That I'm going to die because of this curse?" Sylvia's gaze softened, but her voice was tinged with resignation. "The curse is not about one person, Ethan. It's about the balance of this place. Without the sacrifice, the god will awaken, and nothing will be left. The town will fall apart, and something far worse will come for us all." Ethan stood there stunned as the music from the distant square grew louder, more frantic. The people began to move toward the center of town, their faces blank, their eyes void of emotion. Ethan could feel the god's presence growing, pressing in from all sides. The town had been waiting for this moment, and so had he. The ritual would begin at midnight. The clock struck midnight, and with it came the eerie sound of a gong, low and deep, vibrating the ground beneath Ethan's feet. The streets of Hemlock Ridge were now bathed in an unsettling golden glow, and the air itself seemed to hum with anticipation. Ethan had tried to make his escape earlier, but each time he attempted to leave, the world outside the town felt wrong, like a dream slipping through his fingers. The trees seemed to close in around him. The mountains loomed like ancient giants, their peaks disappearing into an endless sky. The townsfolk gathered around the central square, chanting in a language that Ethan could not understand. Their faces were blank, their eyes glazed over with a strange, unnatural light. They were no longer the people he had met in the diner or walked alongside on the streets. These were vessels, empty and consumed by something much older than they were. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the ground began to tremble beneath his feet. The earth groaned, as though something vast and terrible was awakening beneath it. And then, from the shadows, came the figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, towering over the gathered townspeople. Its body was a shifting mass of darkness, its form amorphous, impossible to comprehend. Its eyes were the only clear feature, two burning, glowing orbs that pierced through the darkness. It was the god of Hemlock Ridge, the one who demanded sacrifice, and Ethan realized too late that he was the one who had been chosen. As the people of the town stepped back, Ethan felt the weight of their gaze upon him. The ritual was about to begin. There was no escape now. Story 3. The Whistler's ghost, David Green, needed a fresh start. The hustle and bustle of city life, the relentless noise of traffic, and the constant pressure at work had worn him down. He wanted peace. He wanted quiet. That's why, when he stumbled across Ashford, a small, seemingly forgotten town nestled in the forests of New England, it felt like a sign. The town was picturesque, like something out of a painting. Cobblestone streets lined with historic houses, ivy creeping up brick walls, and an untouched countryside stretching far beyond the town's edge. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of the city, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. David rented a small, charming cottage at the edge of town, far from the noise and distractions of others. The locals, friendly and polite, seemed to welcome him with open arms. There was an old-world charm to Ashford, and he felt a sense of calm the moment he arrived. He quickly fell into a simple routine. Mornings were spent hiking through the woods, afternoons at the local bakery chatting with townsfolk, and evenings were a time for reading or enjoying the solitude of his new home. For a few weeks, it felt like David had finally found the peace he longed for. But then, something began to disturb his tranquility. It started small, barely noticeable. The first time he heard it, he thought it was the wind or maybe a bird call. It was a soft, high-pitched whistle carried on the breeze. The sound wasn't entirely unpleasant, but there was something about it that felt off, like a note out of place. He dismissed it, assuming it was just the strange noises of living in a new area. But each night it returned, softer at first, but louder each time. David tried to ignore it, but it gnawed at him. He asked a few of the locals if they ever heard the strange whistling sound. Most of them chuckled and waved it off. "Oh, that old thing," one man, Mr. Bennett, said with a smile. "It's just the wind around here, especially at night. It plays tricks on you." Another woman, Mrs. Avery, laughed nervously. "Don't mind it, dear. Some sounds just seem to follow you, that's all." But David couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The whistling became more distinct, less like the wind and more deliberate, as though someone was actually playing a tune in the night air. It was haunting. One evening, as he was walking home from the market, he heard it again, stronger this time, coming from the woods just beyond his cottage. The sound echoed through the trees, the tune rising and falling like a lullaby, but with a dark, chilling undertone. David paused, feeling a shiver run down his spine. His heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but there was something unnerving about the tune, something that felt old and sinister. He couldn't ignore it any longer. There was a story behind this sound, and he needed to find out what it was. The next morning, David visited the local library, hoping to find some answers. The library was small, tucked away on the corner of Main Street. Inside, the scent of old paper and dust filled the air. The librarian, a quiet woman named Miss Lydia, looked up from her desk as he entered. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice soft but welcoming. "I've been hearing a strange whistling sound every night," David explained. "It's been bothering me, and I thought maybe there's some history about it. Something unusual." Miss Lydia's expression shifted slightly. Her eyes flickered with something, recognition perhaps. She nodded slowly as though she'd expected this question. "Ah, yes, you've heard the whistling." Her voice dropped, and she looked around as if to ensure no one else was listening. "You should speak to Margaret." David raised an eyebrow. "Who's Margaret?" "The old woman who lives on the edge of town, near the cemetery. She knows all the stories of Ashford, the ones that aren't in books. Go see her. She'll tell you what you need to know." David was curious but also apprehensive. The way Miss Lydia spoke about Margaret made it clear that this wasn't just a simple request. He thanked the librarian and made his way toward the cemetery. The walk to the cemetery was peaceful but eerie. The path wound through a dense forest, the trees standing tall and imposing, blocking out most of the sunlight. As he neared the cemetery, the air grew still, and the first signs of dusk began to settle in. Margaret's cottage was a small, crooked house at the edge of the cemetery, with vines creeping up the sides of the stone walls. The door creaked as David knocked, and after a moment, an elderly woman opened it, her face worn but sharp, her gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. "You've come to ask about the whistling, haven't you?" she said before David could even speak. Her voice was raspy, like the wind rustling through dead leaves. She stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. David nodded slowly, unsure how she knew exactly what he had come for. He stepped inside, and Margaret closed the door behind him. "You don't belong here, David Green," she said bluntly, her eyes piercing through him. "You're not from Ashford. You don't know what you've stepped into." David felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine as he took a seat in a chair by the hearth. "I've been hearing a whistling sound at night. I need to know what it means," he said, his voice quieter now, filled with a mixture of curiosity and growing unease. Margaret studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "It's the spirit of Elias Whistler," she began, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He was hanged by the town's founding fathers centuries ago. He was a cruel man, a murderer, a thief, but his crime was not the worst of it. His crime was making a pact with something darker than anyone in this town could comprehend." David's blood ran cold as Margaret continued. "Elias Whistler was cursed before he died. The last thing he did was whistle a tune, an eerie, haunting tune. The moment that sound left his lips, the curse was set. That whistle, it was a warning. It marked anyone who heard it. The curse would follow them, slowly consuming their mind, driving them to madness. The spirit of Whistler seeks revenge. He traps the souls of those he curses, forcing them into an endless cycle of torment. The whistling is not just a sound, it is a harbinger." David swallowed hard, his mind racing. "So, what do I do?" he asked, his voice shaky. Margaret's expression hardened, as though the answer was obvious, though David could not see it. "There is nothing you can do," she said gravely. "The curse has already begun. You have heard the whistle. The madness will come soon enough. The only thing you can hope for is to die before it consumes you entirely." David's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to dismiss her words, but something deep within him, something primal, told him that she was not lying. The whistling was real, and it wasn't going away. The wind howled outside as David left Margaret's cottage, her words still echoing in his mind. The curse has already begun. He could barely wrap his mind around it. The idea that a sound, just a tune, could hold such power was absurd, and yet something deep inside him felt an unshakable certainty that it was true. He had already heard the whistle. It was too late for him to turn back now. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, David once again heard the whistling. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't random. The tone was deliberate, each note carefully placed like the brush strokes of a master painter. The sound came from the woods again, but this time it felt closer, almost inside his own home. He tried to ignore it, to lock himself in his room and focus on anything else. But the whistling grew louder, insistent, reverberating through his bones, rattling his sanity. His pulse quickened. His head ached. It was as if the very sound had wormed its way into his mind, burrowing deep beneath his skin, and no matter what he did, he couldn't escape it. David stumbled to the window and looked out into the dark expanse of trees. There, in the shadows between the trunks, he saw something, a figure, standing perfectly still, as if waiting for him to notice. The figure was tall, hunched slightly, and yet, in the moonlight, David could make out no details. It was simply there, waiting. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. His heart hammered in his chest. Could it be Elias Whistler? Was it him, standing just beyond his reach, waiting for David to come closer, to succumb to the curse? The figure didn't move. It just stood there, and the whistling continued. Desperation took hold. David had to know. He had to face whatever this was. The legend, the curse, the truth. Without thinking, he threw on his jacket and rushed outside, ignoring the bitter cold of the evening air. The whistling guided him, like a beacon pulling him into the woods. Every step felt heavier than the last, like invisible hands were tugging at him, urging him forward. The trees closed in around him, the darkness swallowing him whole. He moved blindly, following the sound, until it led him to a clearing in the forest. The whistling stopped. There, standing in the center of the clearing, was a large oak tree, its bark twisted and gnarled, as though centuries of growth had warped it beyond recognition. And at the foot of the tree lay something else, a rusted iron noose, hanging loosely from a branch. David's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. This was the site of Elias Whistler's death. A voice, low and hoarse, broke the silence. "You've come," it said. David whipped around, but there was no one there. Only the oppressive silence of the forest, the trees creaking in the wind, and then the whistling began again. It was louder now, closer, as if the very air had been infected by it. The air around him seemed to pulse with a strange energy, thick with something he couldn't quite name. It was Elias Whistler. David could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The spirit had found him, and now there was no escape. The following days were a blur of confusion and dread. David's mind was unraveling. Every time he closed his eyes, the whistling returned, echoing in his thoughts like a haunting lullaby. The sound followed him wherever he went. When he went to town for supplies, when he visited the library, when he tried to rest in his cottage. It was as if the tune had become a part of him, woven into his very consciousness. He stopped sleeping. Each time he closed his eyes, the whistling was there, ringing louder and louder in his ears, drowning out every other sound. The only thing that kept him from losing his mind completely was his relentless pursuit of the truth. But the truth was becoming increasingly elusive. He visited Margaret again, hoping for some answers, some way to stop the curse from consuming him. "You were right," he said, his voice cracking as he sat across from her in the dim light of her cottage. "I've heard the whistling, and it's driving me mad. I need to know how to stop it." Margaret's gaze was filled with pity. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "It has already begun, David," she said, her voice softer now. "The curse is designed to consume you slowly, piece by piece. It will take your mind, your soul, until you are nothing but a shell, a vessel for Whistler's spirit. But there is one thing you can try, a way to stop it before it's too late." David leaned forward eagerly. "What is it? What can I do?" Margaret hesitated. "You must confront the spirit. Go to the tree where he died. That's where the power of the curse lies, where it all began. If you can face him there, you might be able to break the cycle. But be warned, breaking the curse means becoming the vessel. If you succeed, you will take Whistler's place, and then the curse will never end." David recoiled. "You mean I have to die? Become him?" Margaret nodded, her face grave. "You will be trapped just as he was. The whistling will follow you, and the cycle will continue. There is no escaping it." David's heart pounded in his chest. His eyes were wide, desperate. "But if I don't try, I'll lose my mind, won't I? I'll become him anyway." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, but at least you will understand the price before it happens." David stood up abruptly. He couldn't think about it any longer. He needed to end this. He needed to confront the spirit of Elias Whistler, even if it meant sacrificing his soul. That night, the whistling was louder than ever before. It was no longer just a sound. It was a force, an insidious presence that filled the air, shaking the ground beneath David's feet. He had prepared himself as much as he could. His hands trembled as he made his way to the clearing in the woods, the place where it had all begun. When he arrived, the oak tree loomed in front of him, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The noose still hung from the branch, swinging gently in the wind, as though waiting for him. David took a deep breath and stepped forward, and then he heard it, Elias Whistler's voice, low and mocking, echoing from the shadows. "You've come to take my place," the voice whispered. "You think you can escape me, but you never will." David's heart raced as the whistling began again, rising in pitch until it was deafening. The sound consumed him, filled his mind, and for a moment he couldn't remember who he was. The tune was so familiar, so old, that it felt like it had always been inside him. The figure of Elias Whistler appeared before him, tall and gaunt, his eyes empty pits of darkness. He grinned, his mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "You can't win, David," Elias said, his voice a low hiss. "You've already lost." David felt the cold grip of terror seize his chest. The whistling was deafening now, louder than anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just a sound. It was an assault on his mind. The spirit of Elias Whistler was inside him, filling him with rage, with madness, with despair. David collapsed to his knees, his vision blurring. He was losing himself, slipping into the darkness. He reached out, his hands trembling, and touched the noose. And in that instant, he understood. The curse had claimed him. The next morning, the town of Ashford was quiet. The air was still, and the sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. But there was something different. The air felt heavier, as if something ancient had shifted. And in the distance, just beyond the trees, the faintest sound could be heard. A soft, eerie whistle, rising and falling, carried on the wind. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as Sarah Reynolds stood at the edge of the oil rig, staring out across the Mississippi River. The water below was calm, unnaturally so, as if the very current of the river had stilled in anticipation of something. The day's work had ended, but an eerie quiet hung in the air, unsettling her. The only sound was the gentle hum of the rig's engines, the far-off whine of machinery, and the faint whistling breeze that cut through the metal framework of the structure. Sarah wasn't prone to superstitions, but there was something about the rig, this isolated piece of metal and concrete in the middle of the river, that didn't feel right. It wasn't the job itself. As one of the lead engineers overseeing the oil extraction process, she knew the technical aspects of her work. But over the past few weeks, a strange sense of unease had begun to build. It was in the way the men on the rig would sometimes glance toward the river when they thought no one was looking, as if they expected something to rise from the waters. And then there was the noise. It started quietly at first, a faint whistling sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the river. At first, Sarah assumed it was just the wind or the hum of the rig's engines playing tricks on her. But as the days went by, the sound became clearer, more distinct, almost musical in its haunting quality. No one else seemed to acknowledge it, except for Mark. Mark, one of the rig's lead mechanics, had mentioned it to her once before. "Have you heard it yet?" he had asked one evening, his eyes filled with a kind of wariness she hadn't expected from the seasoned worker. "The whistling?" Sarah had replied, her voice cautious. "You've heard it too?" Mark gave a tight nod. "It's not just me. The whole crew has heard it, but no one talks about it." "Why not?" "Because we don't know what it is," he said, his voice low. "Some of the older guys on the rig, they say it's a warning, that there's something beneath the water, something we woke up." Sarah remembered his words now, as she stood on the observation deck, the same eerie whistling sound tickling the edge of her consciousness again. But this time, it wasn't the wind. She looked toward the water again, straining her eyes against the darkening horizon. But she saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the slow current, the faint ripples of the river, and the distant silhouette of the rig's towering structure against the night sky. And then it happened. A shape, something moving under the water. Too large, too quick to be a fish or anything ordinary. "Mark!" Sarah shouted into the radio. "Get down here, now!" But there was no answer. The static from the radio crackled loudly in her ear, making her pulse quicken. She started down the narrow staircase that led to the lower levels of the rig, but before she reached the bottom, a shout echoed across the deck. "Jake's gone!" Sarah froze. The voice was frantic, panicked. She turned sharply toward the source of the shout. One of the rig's crew members, Tony, was waving his arms toward her. "What do you mean, gone?" Sarah asked, her heart racing. I don't know. He was right by the edge near the water, and then he just disappeared. We can't find him." Sarah's blood ran cold. She knew Jake. He was one of the newer deckhands, a hard worker, always following orders. He wouldn't have just wandered off. Something had happened to him, something worse. Before she could respond, the wind picked up again, the whistling returning louder than ever before. But this time, it was accompanied by a deep guttural growl, something primal and menacing. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She looked over the side of the rig, her eyes scanning the river, searching for any sign of movement. But the river was still, too still. The crew quickly organized a search party, scouring every inch of the rig. Mark and Sarah joined the others, their faces grim as they tried to understand what had happened to Jake. The entire atmosphere on the rig had shifted. The air felt thick with fear, with something ancient and powerful lurking beneath the surface just out of reach. By morning, they had found no sign of Jake, no evidence, no trace. But Sarah's mind wouldn't stop turning. What if Mark was right? What if they had awakened something that had been lying dormant for centuries? She tried to shake off the thought, telling herself it was irrational. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut that the rig's operation was tied to something far darker than they could comprehend. That night, as Sarah walked back to her quarters, she passed the control room, where Carl, the captain of the rig, was hunched over a bank of monitors. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. When he saw her, he stood up sharply. "You need to come in here," Carl said urgently. "I need you to see this." Sarah followed him inside, her curiosity piqued. Carl pointed to a set of monitors, each showing a different view of the surrounding river. But what caught her attention was a red indicator on one of the screens, seismic readings fluctuating wildly. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, trying to make sense of the data. "These numbers, they don't make sense. This isn't just a normal fluctuation." Carl's face hardened. "We've been getting these readings all day. Something is beneath the river. Something big." "That's what I've been hearing," Sarah muttered, still staring at the monitor. "It's the same whistling sound. It's coming from the water." Carl nodded, his voice grim. "It's not just the sound, it's the vibrations. They're unnatural. Something's alive down there, something that doesn't want us here." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean, alive?" "I mean, whatever this thing is, it's waking up." The intercom buzzed suddenly, cutting off their conversation. It was Tony, his voice shaky. "Captain, we've found something, or someone." The crew had gathered in the lower decks of the rig, where Tony had found something that left everyone speechless. It was Jake, or what was left of him. His body had been dragged halfway across the platform, but the most disturbing part was his eyes. They were wide open, but they were lifeless, as though drained of all vitality. "Did he drown?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside Jake's body. The skin was cold to the touch, but there was no sign of water in his lungs, no sign of drowning. "No," Carl said, his voice heavy with dread. This isn't natural." As Sarah studied Jake's body, she noticed something else. There was a strange web-like pattern of bruises around his neck, as though something had gripped him with unnatural force. And then, there it was again, the whistling. It was louder now, almost deafening. Sarah stumbled backward, her mind racing. The sound had grown so sharp, so intense that it felt like it was vibrating in her very bones. "Is this happening to everyone?" she asked, looking around at the crew. "Are we all hearing this?" Mark stepped forward, his face pale. "It's not just the sound. The whole rig's shaking now. Whatever's down there is angry. We need to leave. We need to get off this rig now." But Carl, ever the captain, shook his head. "We can't just leave. If there's something under the water, something that powerful, we need to find out what it is before it comes for us." "Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "We're sitting ducks out here." Carl stared out across the dark, empty river, as if waiting for something to emerge from the depths. We survive, and we figure out how to stop it. Sarah couldn't shake the vision of Jake's lifeless body. The sight of his empty eyes, those hollow orbs that had once been full of life, haunted her. What had happened to him? There were no signs of external injury, no wounds from drowning, but the bruising around his neck. It was as if something had strangled him from the inside, something cold, unrelenting. She glanced at Mark, his face pale, his expression haunted, as if the same thoughts were gnawing at him. "We need to figure out what happened," Sarah said quietly, voice shaking despite her attempts to remain calm. "Yeah, but what happens when we do?" Mark asked, his voice low and filled with dread. "I mean, what if there's no way out of this? What if whatever's under the water wants us all dead?" The thought made Sarah's stomach turn, but she couldn't deny that the idea was beginning to feel more and more likely. What had started as a vague suspicion, a sense of unease, had now become an undeniable reality. Something ancient, something powerful was beneath the rig, and it wasn't content to be ignored any longer. As if to punctuate Mark's words, the whistling sound filled the air again, sharper, louder this time, almost as though it was coming from within the rig itself. It was a sound that scraped against her sanity, pushing her to the edge. And then a deep rumbling shook the rig, a tremor that seemed to emanate from beneath the water, beneath the very foundations of the oil platform. "What the hell was that?" Tony shouted, panic rising in his voice. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her throat dry. "But we need to get to the control room, now." The crew made their way toward the control room, where Carl and a few others were already huddled around the monitors. The red indicators were flashing erratically now, and the seismic activity readings had skyrocketed. Whatever was beneath the water, it was waking up. "We're in trouble," Carl said, his face ashen. "The readings are off the charts. It's as if the whole riverbed is shifting. Whatever the Thalaxians are, they're manipulating the environment itself." "The Thalaxians?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "How do we stop this?" Carl didn't meet her eyes. "I don't know if we can." The word Thalaxian sent a chill through Sarah's bones. What was once an abstract idea, a distant myth that Carl had spoken of, was now a horrifying reality. The creatures beneath the river were not just stirring, they were actively trying to break free, using the oil extraction process to fuel their resurrection. "They've been dormant for centuries," Carl continued, voice hollow. "But the oil, we've been tapping into more than just the Earth's resources. The energy beneath this riverbed is ancient. It's the power that kept them trapped. Now that we've started drilling, we've given them the strength to rise again." A new wave of dread washed over Sarah. She realized, with a sickening certainty, that they hadn't just disturbed a peaceful ecosystem. They had triggered something far worse, a curse that had been waiting to be unleashed. As the crew stood in stunned silence, the whistling grew louder, more distinct, until it was nearly deafening. It wasn't just a sound, it was a call. Something was rising, and whatever it was angry. Mark's eyes widened in horror. "We need to shut the rig down. Now we can't keep going. If we don't, those things, those creatures will finish whatever ritual they started, and we'll be next." Carl shook his head, looking almost resigned. "We can't." It's too late for that. We've already fed them enough. The process is too far along. Just then, the intercom buzzed, and Tony's frantic voice crackled through. "Captain, there's something in the water. Something huge. It's coming towards the rig. We need to evacuate now." Without thinking, Sarah grabbed Carl by the arm. "We have to stop it. We have to destroy the rig before they finish their ritual, before they complete whatever they need to rise." Carl's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment Sarah could see the fear in his gaze. He knew as well as she did that there was no escaping what was coming, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. "It's too dangerous. We don't even know what will happen if we destroy the rig. We might make it worse." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She had already turned and sprinted toward the exit, her mind racing with the only thought she had left: stop the Thalaxians before they could complete the ritual. The wind howled through the rig, whipping at the crew members as they scrambled to secure the structure. Sarah and Mark made their way toward the storage room where the rig's explosives were kept. As they passed through the hallway, Sarah's thoughts raced. They had to stop whatever ritual the Thalaxians were performing, even if it meant sacrificing the rig itself. She had no illusions anymore. The creatures beneath the river were coming, and if they didn't act fast, the ritual would be completed, and the world would be flooded with an ancient evil. As they reached the storage room, Sarah felt a sense of finality. They were past the point of no return. There was no running away from what was coming. They had disturbed something far older and more powerful than any of them had imagined. "Sarah, are you sure about this?" Mark asked, his voice quiet. He was holding a bundle of explosives, his face grim as he looked at her. "Once we set this up, there's no turning back." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. "We have to. We can't let them complete whatever they're doing. We'll set the charges and blow this thing to hell." Before they could set the explosives, the whistling returned, louder than ever. It seemed to vibrate through the entire rig, like a living presence that could not be ignored. Sarah could feel it in her chest, the vibrations matching the beat of her own heart. It was too close now. The Thalaxians were rising. Then, without warning, the water around the rig erupted. A massive tentacle-like appendage broke through the surface, dark and glistening, reaching toward the structure like a snake. It was covered in scales, each one glimmering with an unnatural sheen. More appendages followed, each one massive and moving with terrifying precision. Sarah's heart stopped in her chest as she stared in disbelief at the monstrous creatures emerging from the water. They weren't just animals. They were humanoid figures, distant cousins to ancient sea gods. Their eyes were black as night, filled with malice, and their bodies glowed with a sickly light, their forms shifting and warping as they moved toward the rig. "Get the explosives set," Mark shouted, pulling Sarah out of her trance. But before they could react, the first of the Thalaxians launched itself at the rig with a speed that was beyond anything human. It crashed into the platform, sending debris flying as the crew screamed in panic. The creature's tendrils lashed out, snaking around the rig structure, ripping apart metal and concrete like paper. "We don't have much time," Sarah shouted, pulling Mark toward the detonator. But as they set the final charges, the Thalaxians' shrieks echoed through the rig, as though they knew what was happening. They had no intention of letting the rig go down without a fight. The explosion tore through the rig with an earth-shattering roar, throwing Sarah and Mark to the ground. The entire structure shuddered, and for a moment, everything went silent. Sarah's ears rang, her vision blurred as dust and smoke filled the air. But as she struggled to her feet, she realized that the Thalaxians weren't finished. Their monstrous bodies were emerging from the depths, climbing over the burning remains of the rig. The ritual had already been completed. They had risen, and now they were coming for her. In that moment, Sarah understood. The only way to truly stop them was to make the ultimate sacrifice. She ran toward the center of the rig, where the largest of the Thalaxians towered, its eyes filled with ancient rage. As the creature's massive tendrils reached toward her, Sarah whispered, "I'll end this." With a final cry, she launched herself into the creature's grasp, knowing that by taking its place, she would seal the Thalaxian's fate. The cycle would be broken, but only for a time. As Sarah vanished beneath the dark waters, the Thalaxians' shrieks filled the air, their ritual interrupted. The rig began to collapse, the last remnants of the platform sinking into the Mississippi River. Clara stood frozen at the threshold of the apartment door, the key in her trembling hand. The familiar, comforting warmth of the space was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that filled the air like a thick fog. Her father, Michael, had been found dead earlier that morning. His death had been ruled as natural causes, but there had been no explanation for the unnatural stillness that seemed to cling to every corner of their home. The officer had told her that they would handle the body. "It's best if you don't see him, Miss Quinn," the officer had advised, his voice heavy with an emotion she couldn't place. Sympathy? Pity? But Clara had to see for herself. She hadn't had the chance to say goodbye, to understand the pain that had clouded her father's aging face over the last few months, to grasp what had caused the tightness in his chest. She hadn't noticed anything wrong until he had simply collapsed one night. A sudden tragic end to the man who had raised her with love, despite the mystery of his origins. She entered the apartment, the scent of dust and old wood lingering in the air, mixing with the faint lingering smell of antiseptic. The living room looked as it always had, comfortably disheveled, with stacks of books on the coffee table, an old television set flickering in the corner. But something felt wrong. Clara could feel it in her bones. And then she saw them. Dolls. There were at least 5 of them, positioned around the apartment in odd, meticulous places. On the windowsill, on the couch, one even sitting at the dinner table. They were all eerily lifelike, their porcelain faces eerily smooth, their glassy eyes watching her with an unsettling stillness. What struck Clara the most was their uncanny resemblance to her father. Each one of them had the same face as Michael, his kind eyes, his crooked smile, the slight furrow between his brows. Her breath hitched in her chest. "How?" "Dad," she whispered, unsure whether to speak to the dolls or the empty space around her. Her voice felt too small, too weak for the emptiness in the room. One of the dolls on the couch seemed to shift, its head tilting slightly to the side. Clara froze. Her eyes widened. Did it blink? Shaking her head, she walked forward, closer to the doll, her hands reaching out as though drawn by an invisible force. The soft click of the door behind her startled her, but she didn't turn. Instead, she reached for the doll's face, its porcelain skin cool and smooth beneath her fingers. That's when she noticed it. There was something off about the eyes. Not the usual glassy, fixed stare of the dolls she had seen in stores or museums. These eyes seemed too alive, too aware. The room felt colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She jerked her hand back, stepping away from the doll. Her heart began to pound in her chest. The unmistakable scent of Michael's cologne filled the air, stronger than before. She inhaled deeply, a wave of nostalgia and confusion washing over her. Was this Michael? But how could it be? He was dead. Clara? A voice, a deep, warm voice called out from the hallway. Her heart stopped. It was Michael's voice. Her body screamed at her to turn, but she couldn't. Every muscle in her body was frozen. The scent of his cologne thickened, suffocating her. The voice came again, this time closer, stepping into the room. "Clara, you look troubled," Michael said softly. She finally managed to turn, and there he was, standing in the doorway, as if he hadn't just been dead hours earlier. His eyes were tired, but there was the same warmth in them that had always been there. "Dad?" she breathed, her voice hoarse. Michael smiled, that familiar crooked smile. "It's okay, sweetheart. You don't need to be afraid." But Clara could see the difference now. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth, a stillness in his posture that hadn't been there before, and the smell of cologne. He hadn't worn that in years. The dolls, his face. Her pulse quickened. "Where did these dolls come from, Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael's expression faltered for just a split second, then he gave a gentle chuckle. "You're imagining things, Clara. These are just old things I've had around for years. You remember the old collection, don't you?" But Clara didn't remember. The fear bubbling in her stomach, growing, twisting, choking her thoughts, was something she could no longer ignore. Something wasn't right. Not with the dolls, not with Michael. "Don't worry about them," Michael said softly, stepping into the room as if everything was normal, as if the weight of her suspicion meant nothing. "They're just things that remind me of the past." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't her father standing before her. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences. The dolls multiplied. Clara had found 3 more in different rooms, all bearing the same haunting resemblance to Michael. The worst part was that they didn't just look like him, they moved. Ever so slightly, like shadows slipping between moments. Their heads would tilt, their eyes would blink, their limbs would shift ever so slightly. At night, she could hear their soft creaking, as though they were breathing. Clara spent hours trying to make sense of the events. She turned to the only place she knew might hold the answers, her father's old study. His journals, some yellowed with age, filled the shelves. His writing was meticulous, almost obsessive. She combed through the pages, searching for anything that could explain the dolls, anything that could explain him, and then she found it. One journal entry caught her attention, dated almost 25 years ago. "I've done it. The dolls, they're not just inanimate objects anymore. Elias Finch, the man who taught me everything, has gone too far. His dolls, I can feel them. They live, breathe. They're like us, and they know it. I can't stop them. I can't escape them." The handwriting shook with fear, an unfamiliar emotion for the man she thought she knew so well. But it was the name that caused Clara to pause, Elias Finch. The name stirred something inside her, like a half-forgotten memory. She had to find him. Clara stood frozen at the threshold of the apartment door, the key in her trembling hand. The familiar, comforting warmth of the space was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that filled the air like a thick fog. Her father, Michael, had been found dead earlier that morning. His death had been ruled as natural causes, but there had been no explanation for the unnatural stillness that seemed to cling to every corner of their home. The officer had told her that they would handle the body. "It's best if you don't see him, Miss Quinn," the officer had advised, his voice heavy with an emotion she couldn't place. Sympathy? Pity? But Clara had to see for herself. She hadn't had the chance to say goodbye, to understand the pain that had clouded her father's aging face over the last few months, to grasp what had caused the tightness in his chest. She hadn't noticed anything wrong until he had simply collapsed one night. A sudden tragic end to the man who had raised her with love, despite the mystery of his origins. She entered the apartment, the scent of dust and old wood lingering in the air, mixing with the faint, lingering smell of antiseptic. The living room looked as it always had, comfortably disheveled with stacks of books on the coffee table, an old television set flickering in the corner. But something felt wrong. Clara could feel it in her bones, and then she saw them. Dolls. There were at least 5 of them, positioned around the apartment in odd, meticulous places, on the windowsill, on the couch, one even sitting at the dinner table. They were all eerily lifelike, their porcelain faces eerily smooth, their glassy eyes watching her with an unsettling stillness. What struck Clara the most was their uncanny resemblance to her father. Each one of them had the same face as Michael, his kind eyes, his crooked smile, the slight furrow between his brows. Her breath hitched in her chest. "How? Dad?" she whispered, unsure whether to speak to the dolls or the empty space around her. Her voice felt too small, too weak for the emptiness in the room. One of the dolls on the couch seemed to shift, its head tilting slightly to the side. Clara froze. Her eyes widened. Did it blink? Shaking her head, she walked forward, closer to the doll, her hands reaching out as though drawn by an invisible force. The soft click of the door behind her startled her, but she didn't turn. Instead, she reached for the doll's face, its porcelain skin cool and smooth beneath her fingers. That's when she noticed it. There was something off about the eyes, not the usual glassy, fixed stare of the dolls she had seen in stores or museums. These eyes seemed too alive, too aware. The room felt colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She jerked her hand back, stepping away from the doll. Her heart began to pound in her chest. The unmistakable scent of Michael's cologne filled the air, stronger than before. She inhaled deeply, a wave of nostalgia and confusion washing over her. Was this Michael? But how could it be? He was dead. "Clara?" A voice, a deep, warm voice, called out from the hallway. Her heart stopped. It was Michael's voice. Her body screamed at her to turn, but she couldn't. Every muscle in her body was frozen. The scent of his cologne thickened, suffocating her. The voice came again, this time closer, stepping into the room. "Clara, you look troubled," Michael said softly. She finally managed to turn, and there he was, standing in the doorway, as if he hadn't just been dead hours earlier. His eyes were tired, but there was the same warmth in them that had always been there. Dad, she breathed, her voice hoarse. Michael smiled, that familiar crooked smile. It's okay, sweetheart. You don't need to be afraid. But Clara could see the difference now. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth, a stillness in his posture that hadn't been there before, and the smell of cologne. He hadn't worn that in years. The dolls, his face. Her pulse quickened. Where did these dolls come from, Dad? She asked, her voice trembling. Michael's expression faltered for just a split second. Then he gave a gentle chuckle. You're imagining things, Clara. These are just old things I've had around for years. You remember the old collection, don't you? But Clara didn't remember. The fear bubbling in her stomach, growing, twisting, choking her thoughts, was something she could no longer ignore. Something wasn't right. Not with the dolls, not with Michael. Don't worry about them, Michael said softly, stepping into the room as if everything was normal, as if the weight of her suspicion meant nothing. They're just things that remind me of the past. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't her father standing before her. The next few days were a blur of strange occurrences. The dolls multiplied. Clara had found 3 more in different rooms, all bearing the same haunting resemblance to Michael. The worst part was that they didn't just look like him. They moved, ever so slightly, like shadows slipping between moments. Their heads would tilt, their eyes would blink, their limbs would shift ever so slightly. At night, she could hear their soft creaking, as though they were breathing. Clara spent hours trying to make sense of the events. She turned to the only place she knew might hold the answers, her father's old study. His journals, some yellowed with age, filled the shelves. His writing was meticulous, almost obsessive. She combed through the pages, searching for anything that could explain the dolls, anything that could explain him, and then she found it. One journal entry caught her attention, dated almost 25 years ago. I've done it. The dolls. They're not just inanimate objects anymore. Elias Finch, the man who taught me everything, has gone too far. His dolls. I can feel them. They live, breathe. They're like us, and they know it. I can't stop them. I can't escape them. The handwriting shook with fear, an unfamiliar emotion for the man she thought she knew so well. But it was the name that caused Clara to pause. Elias Finch. The name stirred something inside her like a half-forgotten memory. She had to find him. Clara couldn't get Elias Finch out of her mind. His name haunted the back of her thoughts, echoing like a whisper in the dark. The more she researched, the more she found unsettling connections she couldn't ignore. Elias Finch wasn't just a doll maker. He was a reclusive genius, obsessed with creating lifelike dolls that could replicate the humans they were modeled after. But it wasn't just the craftsmanship that was disturbing. There were rumors, whispers of forbidden rituals, dark magic, and a fixation on immortality. Clara's pulse quickened as she turned the pages of her father's journals. The entry that stood out to her most was the one dated just a few months before Michael had died. I did something unforgivable. I can't go back now. Elias promised me it would work, promised that I could have a life, a real life. But he lied. The dolls, they're more than just toys. They have thoughts. I didn't think they could replace us, but they can. They're not just lifelike, they are alive. Clara slammed the journal shut, her breath heavy in her chest. If this was true, if Michael had somehow been involved with Elias Finch, then her whole world had been built on lies. The thought gnawed at her, twisting inside her like a parasite. If Michael had been alive because of something Elias had done, then what was he? Was he truly her father? Or had he been nothing more than a puppet, a shell of something that had once been human? A sudden horrifying thought struck her. The dolls, they were alive, weren't they? Not just lifelike, but alive. And if they were starting to appear everywhere around the apartment, if they were mimicking Michael, it meant something darker was unfolding. They were replacing him, and soon they would replace everyone she loved. Clara had no choice. She had to find Elias Finch. Clara's search for Elias Finch led her to the outskirts of Chicago, a crumbling neighborhood far removed from the gleaming streets she knew. The houses here were old, their paint chipped, their windows fogged with neglect. It was clear that Elias had deliberately isolated himself from the rest of the world. She found the address listed in her father's journal, a dilapidated mansion on a quiet, forgotten street. A shiver crawled down her spine as she approached the wrought iron gates. They creaked open as though they hadn't been touched in years, revealing the overgrown path leading up to the mansion. The house looked abandoned, as if time itself had swallowed it whole. Ivy crawled up the sides of the building, obscuring its once grand windows. The door was cracked open, a dark void behind it. Clara took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the silence almost unbearable. As she ventured deeper into the mansion, the dim light from the cracked windows barely illuminated the decaying hallways. The floorboards groaned under her weight, but there was no other sound. No creak of furniture, no scurry of rats, no distant echoes of life. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath. The first room she entered was an artist's studio, filled with half-finished dolls. Some were seated, others stood on shelves, their eyes locked in lifeless stares. The craftsmanship was undeniable, the precision of each detail startling. Clara's eyes lingered on one doll in particular, a man, roughly the same age as her father, his features eerily similar to Michael's. But there was something wrong. The doll's eyes seemed too real. They didn't stare blankly, they followed her. She recoiled, her pulse racing. The hairs on her neck stood on end as the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed from behind her. Clara spun around, heart hammering in her chest. A figure stood in the doorway. The man was tall, gaunt, with sharp, angular features. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide with an unsettling intensity. His hair was unkempt, streaked with gray, but his gaze held an undeniable intelligence. "Clara Quinn, I presume," he said, his voice cold, measured. "How do you know my name?" Clara demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. "I've been watching you," Elias replied, his lips curling into a faint smile. "You've been looking for me, haven't you?" Clara took a step back, her mind racing. "What have you done to my father?" she spat, unable to keep the accusation out of her voice. Elias's smile didn't falter. "Your father was never your father, Clara. Michael Quinn was never a man. He was one of my creations." Clara felt the floor beneath her shift, as though the world was suddenly tilting. Her breath caught in her throat. "No, you're lying. He was my father." Elias shook his head slowly. "He was a doll, Clara. I made him. He lived because of a bond I created with him, but he was never human. His eyes gleamed with a strange pride, a sense of twisted satisfaction. I've perfected my craft. The dolls are no longer mere objects. They are life, and now they want more than just life. They want to replace the world as we know it. Clara's mind reeled. You've created them, all of them, but they aren't just dolls anymore. They're alive, Elias interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper. Yes, but not just alive. They are conscious. They can think, and they want to become like us. They want to take over. Clara's heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. Why? Why would they want to take over? Why now? Elias stepped closer, his face becoming a mask of dark fascination. Because the dolls have learned. They've learned that they are not just copies. They are more than just imitations. They can replace the living. They want to replace the world, and they will. A loud crash from the hallway interrupted their conversation. The sound of footsteps, many footsteps, echoed toward them, slow and deliberate. Clara's eyes widened. What's happening? Elias's lips curled into a grim smile. The dolls have already begun to take over. They are replacing everything. The question is, Clara, will you let them replace you? Clara's blood ran cold as the first doll appeared in the doorway behind Elias, and then another and another. They weren't just dolls anymore. They were real, and they wanted her. Clara turned and ran. Her mind screamed for her to get out, to escape, but the house seemed to close in around her. The dolls moved faster now, their movements jerky but deliberate. They were everywhere, emerging from rooms, stepping out of shadows, their eyes fixed on her as though they could already taste her fear. She ran down a narrow hallway, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. She could hear the sounds of footsteps behind her, drawing closer, louder with each passing moment. And then she stopped. At the end of the hallway, the door to a small room stood ajar. Something about it drew her in. She shoved the door open and stumbled inside. The room was dark, but it was filled with more dolls, more lifelike, more terrifying. They sat in neat rows, all facing her, their eyes unblinking. But in the center of the room was a mirror. As Clara looked into the mirror, her reflection stared back at her. But there was something wrong. The face in the mirror wasn't hers. It was another doll, perfectly identical to her, right down to the way her hair fell. The same pale skin, the same wide eyes. She gasped, taking a step back. The dolls around her seemed to whisper, shifting in their seats as though they knew her deepest fear. And that's when it hit her. She wasn't real. Clara wasn't human. She was one of Elias's creations too.